morning, everyone, and welcome to our second webinar in our gut healing program. I hope you all have managed to read through the meal plans, the supplement sheets, maybe listened to the first webinar if you missed it. And thank you everyone as well for all of your comments on the Facebook page and also personal emails about your own gut health as well. I'm more than happy to receive emails and messages about any stool tests or any breath testing that you've had done. So please do remember to send those all to me. So welcome everyone. I'm Christine Bailey. I'm going to be talking to you today about small intestinal bacterial overgrowth and the use of the low FODMAP diet. And I know from already looking at some of your own stool tests and breath tests, this is obviously very relevant to a lot of you. So hopefully you'll find this useful. And do please remember to use the question box and post some questions. If I miss them by any chance, then obviously I will answer those personally or via Facebook page anyway. So today what I want to look at is really one section only of the remove stage. Now remember that for a lot of clients, the remove stage is often the biggest section and often a combination of triggers that may be affecting their own gut health issues. So today I'm going to be looking at SIBO and low FODMAP diets. In the next webinar, we're actually going to look more at the colon, the large intestine, and also look at how we can also look at food reactions and the stool testing and the difference in, for example, PCR and regular stool testing. So we're going to be looking at all of those, but today I just really want to focus on the low FODMAP approach and the SIBO. So I've put here on the slide, there will often be a whole range of aggregating factors that you need to consider. And for a lot of clients, it will be several of these. One of the first will be, have they actually got an infection in the small intestine? And you'll remember from the first webinar, there are often some very distinct signs and symptoms that may be affected rather than or in addition to the colon. So, for example, bloating quite shortly after eating is a classic one. Feeling full very quickly after eating, feeling better if you skip meals, particularly breakfast, not feeling hungry, having low appetite, always feeling a little bit heavy in the stomach. These are all classic symptoms that can often be related to small intestinal issues. It may not be the only thing. Your client may have a colon infection as well. They may also have food sensitivities and intolerances, which we will talk about. It may be stress linked as well. And for some people, there may be aggravating foods that are not an actual immune reaction. So they're not an IgE or an IgG, but they aggravate the condition. A classic is that with Helicobacter pylori, which we will be talking about in the next webinar. So, for example, with Helicobacter, we know that salty food will aggravate it because it actually encourages the growth of Helicobacter pylori. In addition, spicy food, alcohol, sugar, caffeine can all be big triggers when there is more of an issue in the stomach. And of course, looking as well at how our clients eat. So are they eating very late at night? Are they skipping meals and then eating a very large meal in one go? Are they eating on the go? Do they take time to eat? And then also consider, are they on any medications? Some medications, particularly some of the painkillers like codeine, will often slow bowel transit down. Others may actually speed it up. So for some people, SSRIs will actually cause them to have diarrhea, for example. So medications can play a role in terms of aggravating factors for the gut. But when we're talking about SIBO, what I'm referring here is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. Now, the definition of this is where there is an abnormally large number of bacteria, 100,000 per milliliter, present in the small intestine. These type of bacteria are often those that should really be in the colon. And with some of them, they often will have quite profound effects on bowel regularity and bloating. So the classic symptoms will be, as I've mentioned, the bloating is a particular one, or abdominal pain, particularly very shortly after eating. There may be a lot of wind, it may be smelly. It may also lead to a lot of burping or belching, and it can lead to deficiencies, particularly iron and B12. So again, if there is unexplained anemia or B12 deficiency, then that might be another area to look at. Now, for some people, there may be, if they've done a stool test, they may also see fat in the stool. And so steatorrhea, which is often because one of the consequences can be reduced bile flow, so reduced production of bile acids, or that the bile flow is quite thick and therefore not really there to emulsify the fats. And often people find that they react to a lot of foods as well. Now, it can also affect other organs. So for some people, they often feel very foggy-headed. They can't think straight. They get very fatigued. And for some extent, that can be due to liposaccharides, which we will talk about when we look at the colon as well, and how they can affect mitochondrial function, energy production, and inflammation. So the question is why? Why will someone necessarily get an overgrowth in the small intestine? Now, this can be linked to a wide range of things. The first area to think about is, are they producing enough stomach acid? Now, my reasoning for that is because if there is a reduction in stomach acid, then obviously the first area, the small intestine, could potentially have bacteria entering, which really should have been tackled by the stomach acid. Now, that may be a consequence of people as they age will have a lower level of stomach acid, but it may also be stress, it may be medications. So there may be a range of things that could cause low stomach acid. It could be that they've permanently been on Gaviscon or Rennies as well, for example. Also consider digestive enzyme production as well for the same reason. Often those are linked. So if there is low stomach acid, often you will find that that will trigger lower production of pancreatic enzymes. Again, the pancreatic enzymes, often you will find elastase or similar markers in a stool test. For some people, if they have an existing condition, such as inflammatory bowel disease and celiac, this has been shown to be associated with an increased risk of small intestinal bacterial overgrowth as well. And in fact, the bacteria of celiac is often quite different anyway from people that do not have the condition. It may be dietary related. It may be that they have a diet that is high in carbohydrates, refined sugars, fruit juices, and so on. For some people as well, it can be as a consequence of bowel resection, so bariatric type of surgery can often lead to then problems in the small intestine. So hydrogen and methane are often the main gases produced in the digestive system by the bacterial fermentation of carbohydrates. So when these gases appear in expired air, then it often indicates that the carbohydrates have been exposed to bacteria, allowing that fermentation. So this is really the basis of testing. Normally, you will be asked to fast, and the day before, you will normally be also asked to cut out all fibre, so to be having a very white, refined type of diet to eliminate as much fermentation as possible. And then often it will start in the morning, and you'll be asked to blow through a device which will collect a baseline of your gases emitted. Then after that, you'll be given a sugary solution, normally lactulose, could be fructose as well, can be glucose rather. And then normally after every 15 minutes, you'll be called back in to again blow down the tube where those gases will be measured. Those gases are then plotted, and depending on how much they have increased, will often indicate whether there is a likelihood of bacterial overgrowth. Now, testing is available from a range of different labs. So in vivo, biolab, for example, Regeneris, they all will provide this option. But for a lot of clients, you can actually get it done on the NHS if there is significant reason to suspect there could be SIBO. And because it is a lengthy procedure, it can often take an hour, 2 hours. It's often wise to go to a lab and get it done rather than trying to do it on your own. And the debates on the threshold level are still very much being published. It's normally between 15 and 20 parts per million over your threshold level. There can be false negatives and false positives as well. For example, for some clients, if they have very slow movement in their bowel, they're very constipated, then often it will take a long time for that food to even enter the small intestine. And normally by then, the assumption is made that it's already got into the colon. Well, for some of those clients, it may still be working its way into the small intestine. And for others, they might have a very fast transit. So there are different issues with having a SIBO test, but if you are getting around about 15 to 20 parts per million above your threshold, then that is a good indication that there is bacterial overgrowth. It may also indicate that there is a colon infection as well, of course, because you will get movement of bacteria from the colon into the small intestine. So the two can often be very linked. Now, for some people, they may have high hydrogen or high methane, or they may have high both. Now, hydrogen is often linked more to the abdominal bloating and pain. Methane is often linked to constipation because it slows down your bowel transit. So again, symptoms can vary depending on the type of bacteria and whether they are producing hydrogen or methane. Obviously, you could have both, of course, as well. So this is an example of a hydrogen breath test. And here they're looking at both methane and hydrogen, and then looking at the peaks. And often you'll get double peak, and that normally implies that it's hit the small intestine for the first peak, which normally takes around about 60 minutes, sometimes a little bit longer, 90 minutes. And then it will hit the colon. And again, because there'll be bacteria in the colon, you'll get some more bacterial fermentation. So often you'll see that double peak as well. Now, often from a gastroenterology point of view, if SIBO is suspected or has been confirmed, then the first dietary recommendation is often the low FODMAP diet. Now, it's not a solution for SIBO, and I do need to stress that. It's simply a way of avoiding fermentation as much, and therefore alleviating a lot of your symptoms while you work on the overgrowth. And it's really important that the two are done alongside each other, because long term there are complications of following a low FODMAP diet, which we will talk about today. So really you should be looking at a low FODMAP diet for 4 to 6 weeks while you work on the overgrowth. Now, to help you, Nutri-Link have actually produced something called Route to Resolution. We've produced this for a number of different conditions, but the two particular ones, which I will upload on the Facebook page, one is for SIBO, so it's a route to resolution for SIBO. So it will summarise some of the key definitions and the implications of a SIBO infection. But more importantly, and I will have a slide on this later, it will indicate if you want to do a natural antimicrobial approach for SIBO, which would be the most relevant and most likely to be successful. So we will talk about, well, exactly what do we do if we do suspect SIBO. But for a lot of people, following a low FODMAP diet is very, very useful. And this is simply an acronym. It was developed by Monash University in Australia. And it's an acronym for fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols. And it's often recommended both for SIBO and for IBS, particularly where there is significant bloating as well. So the FODMAPs then, and we're not really talking here about whether a food is healthy or nutritious or not. It's really, is this likely to be fermented by bacteria and therefore cause you symptoms? So for example, fructose, and if you read the Beat the Bloat book, you'll see that the actual amount of fructose, what's actually important is whether it's in excess of the glucose in the fruit. So just because something is high fructose, if it's also high glucose, you will actually get transfer of fructose very rapidly into the system. Whereas if there is fructose in excess of glucose, then it's more likely to be around and fermented by the bacteria. So that is all explained in the Beat the Bloat book, and I've given you examples in there about why certain fruits may be high FODMAPs or low FODMAPs. And obviously that will include glucose in the terms of certain syrups like honey, whereas maple syrup is actually safe on a low FODMAP diet. And stevia would be, of course, but xylitol, erythritol, which are often the sugar polyols that we like to use for lower sugar cooking, would not be suitable either. Lactose rather than dairy per se. So lactose, which is the milk sugar, which we'll talk about, is what will necessarily cause the symptoms, whereas casein, such as hard cheese, is unlikely to cause that bloating. And then fructans, which are your classic onions, garlic, and also wheat, rye. And then the galacto are mainly those legumes and beans, which to some extent a lot of people will have problems with. Now, the reason they provoke digestive symptoms is for a number of things. First of all, they are very small in size. When they are malabsorbed, they have what's called an osmotic effect in the gut. This means it's very concentrated. They're very small in size and they're very concentrated. So what the gut wants to do is try and dilute them. And it does that by increasing the delivery of water through the bowel. And that's why for some people, one of the symptoms will actually be diarrhea or very loose stools. Now, as they reach the intestines, and this could be the small and the large intestine, they are then fermented by bacteria. And that, of course, will cause the flatulence, the bloating, in some people, the abdominal pain. And then again, of course, if they're producing a lot of methane, that gas will actually slow peristalsis down. So I've given you a few scientific references there. This is really just a very detailed way of explaining how it can cause issues for either bloating or pain as well. So those are some good papers actually to look at if you're more interested in that. Now, what we do know is that everyone, to some extent, will have a problem with fructose and GOS, the galactose. And that's because we actually lack the enzymes to break down some of these. And that's why if you eat a lot of beans, even if you don't have a bacterial overgrowth, you will often feel a little bit heavy and bloated, for example. These are malabsorbed in the small intestine. The bacteria will rapidly break them down. And these are often the big triggers. And this is important because when we talk about reintroducing the different FODMAPs, we will often leave these ones to last because these are often likely to cause problems. So there I've just listed some of the high FODMAP ones that contain these fructones and GOS. Now remember, again, the Beat the Bloat book has whole tables on what is safe on low FODMAPs and what is to be avoided. So do refer to that if you're unsure. But it's worth mentioning about spring onions because it's only really the white part of spring onion that will cause problems. And this is quite useful because the green bits, which actually provide a lot of flavour, in the same way, a bit like chives, are perfectly safe. So if you want that sort of extra flavouring in your caponata, which is on the meal plan, or even an omelette, for example, you could still get away with adding those for flavour. And again, you'll see here as well, obviously, gluten's out on our meal plan anyway, but that is also very high in fructans, for example, and often very hidden, as a lot of you will know, in many, many foods. And also bear in mind, a couple of the nuts are often high FODMAPs, so cashew and pistachio. Obviously, it's not true for everyone. And remember with FODMAPs, it's always about the amount you eat in one sitting. So you may actually get away with a spoonful of cashew nut butter or just a handful of cashew nuts. But if you start eating more than that, then it may cause you a problem. And the same applies to some of the vegetables as well. So again, I've got clients who are able to eat a small amount of beetroot or broccoli, but not a whole plateful. So again, for some clients and for yourselves, it's worth exploring, well, how many asparagus could I eat? Can I eat 2? Can I eat 5? And for lots of people, it will vary. It will also vary as well with the whole meal that you're eating. So if the rest of your meal is very much dominated by low FODMAPs, you probably won't have a problem. But if you try and eat broccoli and beetroot and asparagus at the same time, then that may well tip you over the edge. By the way, thank you for all your questions. I'm going to take a break after we've just gone through the FODMAPs and I'll answer those. So please keep posting and I will answer those questions. So thank you, everyone. So with fructose, again, this is because the absorption relies on the activity of transporters, and this is influenced by the amount of glucose, which is why it's the ratio of the two that is particularly important. And again, I have had clients that do malabsorb fructose. I have one little girl, and the gastroenterologists have done the whole range of tests, and then we decided to actually test her on fructose, and you can actually do a breath test just for fructose. She was malabsorbing, and as soon as she cut out the high fructose foods, which included some vegetables as well, all her diarrhea stopped, and it was very, very dramatic. So for some people, it may be just fructose that they need to avoid. As a lot of people don't know, they follow the low FODMAP plan for 2 to 3, maybe 4 weeks, and then they start reintroducing. And that's when you often find out your triggers. And again, remember that fructose is in a whole range of foods, not just fruit. So vegetables, certain drinks, obviously, and also check for those labels with corn syrups and honey and so on as well. They can often cause problems. Now, again, lactose, and if you've done your DNA, you will probably know whether or not you have lactase persistence or not. And obviously, for certain cultures and ethnicities, lactose intolerance is more of an issue than in others. Again, there are 2 different types of lactose intolerance, primary and secondary. Secondary is because there is something else going on. So, for example, with celiacs, if they are first diagnosed and the villi are compromised, that is where you're producing your lactase. So for celiacs, often initially, they will often find a problem with lactose. But as that villi recovers, they may be able to tolerate it. The same occurs for inflammatory bowel. When people often have flare-ups or they've just been diagnosed and it's not managed, they again will often have problems with lactose. That's secondary. Primary is often more to do with a genetic predisposition. So again, this is a disaccharide. It contains glucose and galactose, and again, you need that enzyme in sufficient amounts to help with its breakdown. Now, what's interesting, of course, is if you look at the Western diet, then actually a large part, 10%, of the diet is estimated to contain lactose. And remember, it's hidden in a lot of foods, in processed hams, in meats, in a lot of vegetarian type foods. You'll often see lactose added as well. And I mentioned already that there are lots of triggers of lactose intolerance. It can be inherited. And remember, lactose intolerance is more common in adults, whereas dairy allergy is more common in children. But if someone already has a sensitivity or inflammation, then it is more likely that the production of lactase is compromised. Also, if you have got a parasitic infection, you've got viruses, you've got Giardia, you've got bacterial overgrowth in the colon, this can also affect lactose intolerance, because often there is a lot of systemic inflammation. So, you know, for some people, it may be temporary, it may not be long term. And there I've just listed, and remember, this is in the Beat the Bloat book as well. High lactose foods are those that are really classed as having 4 grams or more per serving. But again, it's very individual. So the classic for reintroduction is normally 1/2 to 1 cup of milk. And that should be enough to trigger someone's lactose intolerance or lactose symptoms. And this means that it's very different, of course, than going completely dairy free. Now, I am suggesting, because lactose can be, or dairy rather, can be a problem in terms of cross-reactivity with autoimmune conditions, and often a big trigger for gut problems per se, not necessarily because of the lactose, but maybe because of the casein or the whey or the butyrylin, then I recommend that for a lot of people, they are better off taking dairy out. But if you just want to follow a low FODMAP diet, or you want your client to follow a low FODMAP diet, then they could, for example, make their own yogurt, they could eat hard cheese, and they could eat butter. So again, it's very individual. Some people will react to all dairy, others may be able to tolerate a little bit of some of the very low lactose versions. What we now know is, we used to think that lactose or lactose intolerance rather, just affected the gut. However, some of the latest research is suggesting that it could actually cause other symptoms which are more systemic, again, partly because of the inflammation. So reflux, mouth ulcers, muscle pain, joint pain, brain fog, migraines, headaches. These have all now been linked to lactose issues as well. So it's important just for us to understand there is a big difference between lactose intolerance and dairy allergy. Because lactose intolerance, if someone is diagnosed with that, it doesn't necessarily mean that they can't enjoy dairy. And also, of course, there is now a massive growth of lactose-free dairy products as well. And that's important when you're looking at retesting yourself with the low FODMAPs, because for some people, it's not the casein, it's the lactose, and they feel fine when they have lactose-free milk, for example. But if they had regular milk, they would have a problem because of the lactose. So for some people, it can be useful to know that it is a big of a difference between lactose and casein. And again, I've mentioned that, you know, for some people, the amount they have in one sitting will vary. The traditional cutoff is a cup of milk. But what people will often find is that if they space out their lactose consumption, a bit like, you know, other low FODMAPs, through the day, they won't necessarily get the symptoms. But if they eat it in one sitting, they will. So again, it's how you combine your meals that may be important as well. Now, the polyols Now, this is a tricky area because some of these are naturally found in foods. So, for example, sorbitol and mannitol. Mushrooms, for example, are a classic for being high. But others are added, such as xylitol and erythritol. And, you know, as a lot of you will know, these are not just added to foods, but they're also added to protein powders. They're often added to what we would class as healthier drinks or snacks, and also toothpaste. And actually, Susie, while we're on that, you asked the question about what about toothpaste. Toothpaste generally should be absolutely fine for low FODMAPs, because unless you're swallowing the whole toothpaste tube, you're not really going to be consuming enough to have a problem. But some people, if they're eating a lot of chewing gum, I mean, chewing gum is not recommended anyway, because all that chewing will often cause a lot of gas and bloating anyway. But also, most of them these days are sweetened with xylitol. And for some people, you know, if they're constantly, you know, chewing gum through the day, that is going to be a problem. But in toothpaste, it's unlikely to cause real problems. So again, some of the vegetables, cauliflower, mushrooms, we often use mushrooms as a tester as well when we reintroduce mannitol. Peaches, watermelon, and again, the amount that you eat. So sweet potato will be fine as long as you don't eat a huge amount. So the cutoff is normally half a cupful. And again, celery, as long as, again, you're not eating huge amounts. And celery is quite a good one, because if you're making your own stock or vegetable flavourings for, you know, bouillon powder, it's quite a nice one to add to the base of a soup if you can't, for example, have onions and garlic. And then the sugar polyols, the sorbitol, those are high in certain fruits, particularly apples. And of course, you know, we often recommend apples later on in a gut program because of the pectin and the fiber and the polyphenols, which actually can support beneficial bacteria. But at this stage, particularly if you have bacterial overgrowth, it would not be appropriate. And again, the same with avocado. So a small amount of avocado is likely to be fine, but if you eat half an avocado, that's likely to cause you some symptoms. So do remember, it's not necessarily saying you can't have some of these foods, it's the amount you have. So the normal recommendation for a FODMAP exclusion is around about 4 to 8 weeks, so up to 2 months. Normally, if the FODMAP diet is going to help alleviate your symptoms, you should really notice a difference within a week. So people will often have an idea as to whether it's going to help them or not within 2 or 3 weeks at least. The question is, well, what do I eat? Now, this can be tricky depending on whether you are also struggling with other food reactions. So eggs, so protein generally is great on a low FODMAP diet, but obviously if you have an allergy to eggs or fish, then obviously there's certain you know, foods that you're going to have to avoid. But eggs with low FODMAP vegetables, so I often recommend to my clients, why don't you have an omelette with some spinach, which is low FODMAP, or red pepper, which is also low FODMAP. Leftover veg, as long as they're low FODMAP, would also be great. For vegans, scrambled tofu, and that's using the silken tofu, which you just mash up, and I often add things like cumin or turmeric to that as well, or even gluten-free soy sauce for flavouring. That would all be suitable. The granola that you've got the recipe for would also be suitable, and maybe with either low lactose milk or almond milk or soya milk, or other milk alternative, or you could use dairy-free yogurt or your own fermented low lactose yogurt. Some of the shop bought yogurts will be high lactose, others will be low. It's a question of sort of, you know, finding out which one's suitable for you. Often you'll find the Greek yogurt is often fermented for longer, so that often is more tolerated. Gluten-free breads would obviously be fine. I'm not saying they're healthy, but they would be fine on a low FODMAP. I've also given you some recipes for your own options as well for either gluten-free breads or paleo breads or crackers. Again, smoked salmon or hot smoked trout or salmon or mackerel or sardines would all be suitable as well. Olives are fine, so you could always add those to something. I've also given you a recipe for millet porridge, but you could make quinoa porridge or millet porridge. That would also be fine. Or even a rice pudding with added protein powder. Now, protein powders are a tricky one. The one I tend to recommend for clients is the pea protein isolate. So peas are obviously quite bloaty, but the isolate is absolutely fine. I personally like the New Zest brand just because the flavouring is very good and it's natural flavouring as well without added xylitol. So I just find my clients like those ones. And then again, snacks. So it could be a whole range of options. Often it could be vegetable based. Meats, fish would always be suitable. Hard-boiled eggs. Olives, cherry tomatoes, rice cakes, nut butters. Just don't eat too many pistachio or cashew. Again, all fine, or a protein shake, for example. Now, I mentioned earlier that following a low FODMAP diet for too long is not recommended. One, because you really need to be working on removing the infections, but also because the whole point of having fermentable carbohydrates in your diet is to provide fermentable food for your beneficial bacteria. And what these studies have now shown is that if you are following a low FODMAP diet for too long, you actually cause a decline in your bacterial diversity, and particularly the beneficial bacteria such as the bifidodin species in particular, and to some extent lactobacillus, but mainly the bifidodin bacteria. And as a consequence of this, this can then cause changes to the innate immune system in your gut. It can change the peripheral hypersensitivity, so it can actually increase pain. And of course, it reduces the production of short-chain fatty acids, which are crucially important for the health of the colon and also help to lower inflammation in the colon as well. So there are lots of papers now on reducing fermentable fibres and how that affects the gut flora, and therefore potentially could even increase some of your other symptoms. But that's just an example of one of the papers. But the short-chain fatty acid one is also of concern because this is the primary metabolite for the colonocytes. So this is fuel for for the health of the colon. And of course, for the short-chain fatty acids, you can obviously measure these in a stool test. So that's quite a good indication as to whether or not you are producing enough butyrate and so on. And we know that a lot of the bacteria that are affected are major butyrate producers. So you know, we know that by restricting their fermentable fibre, you will have an impact on, for example, butyrate. And remember that butyrate is often one thing that we recommend for lowering inflammation and for helping people with colitis and Crohn's disease, for example. So, you know, there's lots of studies now to suggest that long-term restriction is really not a good idea for a healthy gut flora. So there are implications of restricting that fermentable fibre. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that your fibre intake has to decline significantly. You can still get some fibre by using multigrain breads, which are quinoa, millet, the whole of the millet grain. And of course, adding in a little bit of flaxseed, chia, rice bran, and including bananas, raspberries, and so on, which also have some fibre in there as well. So you can make sure that you get a reasonable amount of fibre on a low FODMAP diet. Can I just check that everyone can hear me? Because there seems to be a few issues with the internet from my side, I can see. I'm going to answer some questions as we just go through some of the next stages. Stephanie, you've asked, how soon after eating does the person have diarrhea? This is obviously on a sort of FODMAP diet, I presume, or if they've got SIBO. So it will normally be within an hour. So it'll often be that urgency of I need to go to the toilet very quickly. So it will often be related to that. Susie, you've mentioned what kind of gut infections other than SIBO and H. pylori. So there I'm referring to colon infections. So colon infections, which could be a whole range of bacteria. It could be candida, it could be parasites, for example, could also cause issues for you as well. And Julie, you've asked about the green part of the leeks. So leeks tend to be much higher FODMAP than spring onions. So I would be honest with you, I would avoid all of the leek because it tends to be higher fibre and higher fermentable. So leeks I would keep out, unfortunately. Stephanie, you've also asked about, I mentioned DNA testing. I mentioned because you can now test for lactose persistence. The one I use, and this is just a personal preference because I find the lab very good and I find the genetic markers that they test for very reliable and robust in terms of research, is Nordic Laboratories. And they offer a DNA health test, a DNA diet test. They also offer one for estrogen metabolism and one for sports. And I use a whole range of those, but I tend to use just the DNA health one, to be honest, because that covers most of the markers. That also covers things like caffeine sensitivity, alcohol now, as well as lactose. So again, that's quite a useful one as well. And Bex, you've asked about whey. So whey is a tricky one because the amount of lactose will vary depending on the individual brand. I do know that the Solgar one is relatively low lactose because they've tested that. Normally, you should be able to contact a lab and ask them, can you tell me the lactose? If you're getting, and this is quite important, if you're getting a whey concentrate, it's likely to be higher lactose than a whey isolate. I prefer whey concentrate because it contains much more of the immunoglobulins in there, because it's the whole of the protein. But for someone that is following a low FODMAP diet, they would need to have a whey isolate. So hopefully that does help answer some of your questions. I've also included here a couple of slides on if you need to tweak this because of certainly dietary restrictions. So low FODMAP in vegetarians is a little bit more restrictive, particularly also if you're vegan rather than vegetarian. And that's because, of course, beans and pulses, which are obviously a good source of protein, are going to be absolutely out on a low FODMAP diet. It doesn't mean you can't get protein. So eggs, of course, tofu, tempeh, choose the unflavoured ones. Sometimes, particularly, well, both tofu and tempeh are often flavoured with garlic and onion. So just watch those. Quinoa. And of course, if you're vegetarian, you can still have low lactose yogurt and cheese. And certain nuts and seeds as well. Obviously, vegan, you're more restricted to things like tofu. Some of the corn may be suitable, but again, it's often flavoured. So I'm not a big fan of corn. But, you know, for some people, that may be appropriate as well. It may be that that is where you need to have a protein powder, such as a pea isolate, just to make sure you're getting enough protein. And of course, you can do it paleo as well if you want to. So, you know, remember that all the protein-rich foods, like the meats and the fish and so on, are all suitable on a low FODMAP diet. You will have to watch certain vegetables, but there's a whole range of vegetables, particularly a lot of the spinach, pak choi, the kale, those are all absolutely fine. The only thing you'll have to watch is that you still get enough fibre, because you'll have to watch the amount of potato and sweet potato you eat, and also some of the starchy veg such as carrots, beetroot. You'll just have to watch the amount you eat, but you can still include obviously a lot of kale and spinach and so on, so you're going to get that. You can still include chia seeds and flax seeds, so you can still get fibre in that way as well. So of course the key thing is, let's address the cause. So that's where I feel the route to resolution will be helpful, because I know some of you are concerned about your SIBO. Now, ADP oregano is fantastic for SIBO, but I would probably add some others. I would probably add in garlic plus. Now, you might think, is that a bit strange because garlic is high FODMAPs? The garlic supplements are absolutely fine on a low FODMAP because it's very much the extract only. So don't worry about that. So I would probably add ADP and garlic plus together. If you know that you also have a colon infection and you have yeast, then you might want to add some other things as well. You need to obviously limit your anything that contains inulin or FAS or any prebiotics, and that's why, of course, the bifidus bacteria powder is included in your supplements. Check your stomach acid. Remember at the beginning I said that often the bacterial overgrowth is often a sign that you've got low stomach acid. So that's where you may want to look at something like hydrozyme, which includes some HCl support, but also some enzyme support as well. You could just take HCl, as long as you know you haven't got ulcers or any other stomach inflammation, of course. You need to make sure, and this is true for everyone, that you have regular bowel movements. So again, if you know that you've got more methane bacteria and you tend to be more constipated, and the bifidus bacteria doesn't help sufficiently, then I would add in Lipidex, which is a magnesium formula that we often use to help with bowel movements. I would maybe look at bile support. Beta TCP or beta plus is a really nice way of not only supporting fat digestion, but also bowel movements. And if you are very constipated, then consider some buffered vitamin C powder. I like the Allergy Research one, which I would use titrated through the day. So really it's just a bowel tolerance. So for some people, 1 teaspoon will be sufficient. For others, they may need a little bit more. Obviously looking at sufficient water intake, herbal teas and so on through the day as well. And then exercise, particularly aerobic exercise, is very good for getting the bowel moving, and castor oil packing as well. So Nutri-Gold will sell castor oil and also the castor oil packing, and I do find this very useful for helping with abdominal pain, bloating, inflammation, but also supporting the bowel movements as well. So you will need to look at addressing the cause while you follow a low FODMAP diet. Then, as you are getting your symptoms reduced and you're on an antimicrobial program, then you need to start looking at which of the FODMAP groups most affects me. And this is what we call the reintroduction phase. So again, I've given you lots of detail in the Beat the Bloat book, but I just want to go through it. The first group we generally test for is the polyol group. And this tends to be because these tend to be more easily tolerated by people rather than something like the GOS or the fructans. And you normally do a test. So the test is often something with high sorbitol. So this would be a quarter or half an avocado or 2 fresh apricots, or around about 4 dried apricots. And what you would tend to do is add these foods either at breakfast or lunch one day, and then monitor your symptoms. If you get lots of bloating that day, then I would stop those sorbitol, mannitol, and calm yourself down. So go back to a low FODMAP diet, and then maybe try a different group. So try mannitol, which would be half a cup of mushrooms, or half a cup of cauliflower. And it doesn't matter if it's cooked or raw. Often people find the symptoms are worse when it's raw. So some people like to try things cooked first and then try it raw. Obviously not for everything. But you know, for some people, either will cause them problems. If you don't get symptoms from the avocado or the apricots, then you can either try it again, either the next day, or have 1 day break and then try it on a Wednesday. So you might try it on a Monday and then try it again on a Wednesday, or you say, I think I'm okay with apricots and avocado, so I'm actually going to now try mannitol, and I'll try either mushrooms or cauliflower. And you will wait to see, normally a day, whether you're going to get any bloating. People will often know within, you know, a couple of hours of eating those foods whether it affects them or not, but you can wait an extra day if you want to. If you find the polyols, so the mannitol, the sorbitol, is fine and you're not getting bloating, then you would then try lactose next. And that would be 1/2 to 1 cup of milk in one sitting, or 6 ounces of regular yogurt. Not flavoured yogurt, just plain yogurt. Again, if that was safe and you didn't have any reactions, you would then move on to fructose. And that would be either 1/2 a mango or 1 teaspoon of honey. All the instructions are in the Beat the Bloat book, but it's just good to go over them. The final groups of foods would be the fructans and the galacto-oligosaccharides. So that would be the equivalent of 1 slice of regular bread. You would then, if that was okay, you would then have 2 slices of bread in one sitting, or a garlic clove, or a bit of onion. And then you would have, if that was okay, 1/2 a cup of any of those beans or green lentils, and that would be 1/2 a cup cooked. Now, it may be, of course, that you don't want to introduce certain foods, so you may know that you already have a problem with gluten for other reasons, or dairy, but that would be the general procedure for a low FODMAP reintroduction approach. You must only test 1 FODMAP food at a time. You must have a sizable amount, so the amount that's mentioned that reflects effectively a portion size, because if you only have a very small amount, it's unlikely to cause you problems. And the reason why those particular foods have been suggested, like the apricots or the avocados, because they only contain 1 type of FODMAP. So it's easy then to know, okay, it's sorbitol that affects me, or it's mannitol that affects me, or it's a different polyol like xylitol that affects me. So it's a long procedure. And normally you're going to be looking at several weeks of testing the different groups of FODMAPs before you get through the whole of those different FODMAPs to know which ones affect you. Don't make any other diet changes. So if you've excluded caffeine or alcohol, don't start drinking it now. So you must make sure everything else is normal, and you're only really testing 1 particular FODMAP group. Otherwise, you're not going to have much of a clue as to which ones affect you. And of course, if you don't get symptoms, then that's great. And it will probably also mean that you've tackled your gut infection. If you are still getting loads of symptoms, it may be that you still need to work on eradicating the bacterial overgrowth that's causing a problem. Now, of course, for some people, they may not have a bacterial overgrowth. They may have a specific problem with lactose, for example, because they lack the enzyme. But for a lot of people, it is more of a reflection that there is a bacterial overgrowth. So it may be that you have to keep following the low FODMAP diet and increasing or continuing with the antimicrobials. And if you get symptoms, then you stop those foods, you go back to a low FODMAP diet, and you wait until you're symptom free. And then you either try a different food from that same FODMAP group. So if avocados affected you, you might try apricots. Or you assume that that FODMAP group is a problem for you at this moment in time, and you try a different FODMAP group. It doesn't mean these groups will be avoided for life, because it really will depend on the balance of the bacteria in your gut. So you have to remove the triggers and then support digestive enzyme stomach acid. And it may well be that moving forward, some of those FODMAP groups will be absolutely fine for you. So please don't think that you will always have a problem. I'm just going to answer a few more questions, so please do post. That's the end of the webinar today. I do refer you to the Beat the Bloat book for not only recipes, but also more details on the safe FODMAP groups and so on. I do suggest, if you are experiencing abdominal pain and bloating, that you, for the first couple of weeks, follow a low FODMAP diet. If you already know that you have bacterial overgrowth, then you will need to follow it for longer, and your remove section with the ADP and maybe Garlic Plus will be longer as well. We're obviously only doing it over a 4-week program, but for some of you, you may have to be on the remove section for a little bit longer. So let me just answer a few more questions. Margie, you've asked about the Zest protein. It's Nuzest, so Nuzest. If you've got an IgG to peas, then no, it won't be suitable. So for you, Margie, you might need to find a different protein powder. If you're okay with eggs, you could do an egg protein powder. If you're okay with whey, you could do a low lactose whey, or you could use something like collagen protein powder. I like the Arthread protein powder, for example. You can also get paleo protein powders, which are often beef or bovine based. Some of the soya isolates might be okay if you're okay with soya as well. Rice can be a bit bloaty for a lot of people, so you might need to be careful with that one. But I wouldn't have pea protein if you know you have an IgG to peas. So that's your question done. I've got a question here about gum. So xanthan gum, guar gum, acai gum, resistant starch, glucomannan and coconut flour. Okay, so one of the things that the Monash University are still doing is testing some of these foods. Now they have shown that coconut flour in small amounts is safe, but a lot of it is likely to cause you bloating. And the same goes with xanthan gum. So a very small amount will probably be okay for you, but again, too much is not. I would suggest that glucomannan, which I don't think has been tested by Monash, would not be appropriate. I think that will cause you much more bloating. I often, in replace of xanthan gum, if people know that xanthan gum is a problem, I often use other binders. So if eggs are okay, you can use eggs for binding, or even psyllium husks. In small amounts will probably still be okay for you. And again, ground flaxseed and ground chia can often be used as well as replacements. So hopefully that has helped answer your question. And then Debbie Ann, you asked a question about pescatarians. Is fish okay? Absolutely fine, but caveat is any additives. So for example, sardines canned in olive oil will be absolutely fine, but if they're in a sauce which will often have onion and garlic in, then it won't be safe. And also often those sauces, such as, you know, they do barbecue and tomato sauces, often have sugars in, and they often will be fructose. So as long as they are plain, smoked fish is fine as well, as long as it again hasn't got extra flavourings on there, or you know, a fructose sort of sugar coating as well. But yes, fish absolutely fine, and the same with seafood, you know, shellfish absolutely fine as well. Proteins are not so much of a problem, apart from obviously the beans and pulses for vegetarians. And then Claudia, you've asked here about how long do you think I should do the remove phase. If you have confirmed SIBO, then I would suggest 4 to 6 weeks at least of ADP and Garlic Plus in order to really tackle it. It may be a little bit longer, but that's the amount I would use. If you know also that you have other issues going on in the colon, such as parasites, then in addition to garlic plus and ADP, I would actually add Intenzyme Forte away from meals. Now, the reason I say that is that's very useful for parasitic eggs and cysts. So if you know you've also got parasitic issues, then I would suggest adding in Intenzyme Forte at a dose of 4 away from meals twice a day, just to hit the cysts as well. And then Margie, you've mentioned eggs, whey or soya or rice. Oh, bless you. So maybe try collagen powder. And if you are concerned about your amino acid intake, you could also consider something like the Free Aminos by Bartik's Research, which is a very good one for just making sure you get the right amino acids. But maybe collagen powder, maybe bone broth as well would be good options for you. And if you do eat meat and fish, then you can still get sufficient protein by just eating, meats and things like that as well. And then Rosie, you've asked a question. If you do not have diagnosed SIBO but do have IBS symptoms, then should you just follow the supplement program suggested, or should you take additional antimicrobials that you mentioned? I would suggest it varies depending on why you think you've got IBS. Do you suspect you've got a colon infection, and have you done a stool test, for example? Is it more related to specific food or stress or medications? So I think it really does depend on why you think you've got IBS, because there will be a trigger, and we will be talking about that in the next webinar, in which case I would suggest, again, if you suspect you've got an actual gut infection and you're suffering, for example, with a lot of bloating and abdominal pain, then I would consider ADP for 4 to 6 weeks. If you don't know why you've got that issue, then I would just follow it for a couple of weeks and see, does the ADP help? Does it help your IBS symptoms? That will often give you an indication. It may be that you haven't actually done a stool test. And then Anne, you've asked a question, which is, are the questions and answers going to be recorded? Yes, this whole webinar is recorded, and Leah will upload it later today for you to listen again. So please don't worry, it will all be recorded. And then you've asked a question about, someone's asked another question about SIBO. I'm going to post the route to resolution, which lists some of the key antimicrobials that we recommend for SIBO. But the key ones I would suggest is Garlic Plus and also the ADP. And then Nicola, you've asked a question about ADP and Campylobacter. Yes, ADP should be sufficient for Campylobacter. It depends whether you've had that identified with a stool test and whether they've done the sensitivity testing, because it may be that they've shown that grapefruit seed extract is also very useful for it on your particular stool test, in which case I would add in the paramycrocidin, which is the Allergy Research, at 250 milligrams at a dose of 2 capsules with each meal, and I would add that as well. So a big thank you to everyone for all your questions, for sticking with us and listening. I do hope you found this useful about SIBO and low FODMAPs. Our next one is Tuesday the 24th. So it's not a Monday, it's a Tuesday. At the same time, just quickly, someone's just asked a question. Lucy, you've just asked a question about ADP, Clostridia. Yes, again, ADP is very good for Clostridia. I would take 4 at each meal, so hopefully that's helped. But again, just to remind you all, the next webinar is next Tuesday. Don't think it's Monday, it's Tuesday, same time, 12, and we're going to talk about stool testing and also looking at how to replenish things like digestive enzymes, stomach acid, not just obviously with supplements, but more importantly by tweaking your food. So do keep posting things on Facebook, any questions, any tests that you've had done, any advice for your own health or your clients, please do post them, because we are here to help. Thank you everyone, and I'll speak to you soon.